Hello, welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie, and today we're at Central United Methodist Church in Asheville, North Carolina. For almost half a century, Sojourners, a magazine and faith community, has provided a guiding light for American progressives in the Christian church scene. Advocating for social justice, reconciliation, peace, and cultural healing, this movement is led by the Reverend Wallace, one of the most influential church leaders of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. And Jim is here today to talk to us about challenges facing the American church in the contemporary setting. Reverend Wallace, may I call you Jim?
Please do.
I feel like I've been reading about you and reading your work for a great part of my adult life. You've had a wonderful ministry, still going very strong. Founder of Sojourners, President and still Editor-in-Chief. You were advisor to the Obama White House during the Obama administration. I'm just curious, in the early 70s when you were starting Sojourners, could you ever have imagined that it would take you to the White House?
That wasn't the plan. It sounds like we've been friends for a long time, so nice to finally
I feel like we have,
meet.
Yes.
Yeah. We just were at a moment of crisis in the early 70s and wanted to lift up the message of Jesus, like lifting up a flagpole, and the little tabloid was like a flag and a flagpole. We didn't know who agreed with us, and all kind of folks on the ground saw that flag and came running to the flagpole. And that became the beginning of our constituency and then movement now all around the world.
Right. And you've been tireless in your advocacy for social justice and working against racism, particularly in America. I'm just wondering what that phrase social justice means to you now. Does it mean something different than it did 40, 50 years ago?
The Apostle James famously said, "Faith without works is dead." So Sojourners' mission is to put faith into action for justice. So we would call it, a lot of us would say, walking our talk. A lot of people, young people especially, see a lot of talk, but they don't see much action. So we're now a network, a magazine, a movement, a network around the world trying to put faith into action for justice, which means justice means biblically the establishing or reestablishing a right relationship. Things have gone wrong, and how do we bring us back together into relationship with each other, with our neighbors, with our enemies even, and with the creation itself? How do we, justice, the lovely word of shalom in the Bible, means putting things back together again. How do we establish justice in the name of faith?
Right. And that's a tall order.
It is.
It's been something you've devoted your life to. So I know you don't particularly like labels, but often it's said that you represent progressive evangelicals or the evangelical left. Here in the South, oftentimes we equate evangelicalism with more kind of fundamentalist faith. Can you explain or differentiate between a progressive evangelicalism and evangelicalism as we might think about it in the South?
Well, there is a religious right. There is a group of religious leaders who have really aligned themselves with the right, often the extreme right wing, and they want to be a religious right. Well, I don't want to just be a religious left as an alternative to them. I think faith, here's the thing, faith should shape our politics, not the other way around. So I don't want to twist my faith into a political mold like they have done on the religious right. I want to say, where does faith hold us all accountable? What does it mean to say we're followers of Jesus, especially? What does that mean? We're in a crisis right now, a deep national crisis. And even our polarization, we would define the crisis differently. The arguments about what the crisis is. But in a crisis, the vulnerable always are the most vulnerable. So back to that word evangelical, which I still claim it, which is tough in these days. But I want to define it the way Jesus did. His opening sermon at Nazareth, I call it his Nazareth manifesto, his first gig, his opening word. He said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me," he's quoting Isaiah, "because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor." That's what he said at the outset. That's the mission. So any gospel means to be good news to the poor. That isn't good news to the poor isn't the gospel of Jesus. And I think people don't hear that these days. And we should be known for those who are standing for the ones he taught us to stand with and for. He says, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was naked, I was a stranger. That means immigrant, refugee. Right. I was in prison, I was sick. As you've done to them, you've done to me. It was me. So to me, that's the core of this message if you want to be a follower of Jesus.
And you've just paraphrased Matthew chapter 25.
Which was my conversion text.
I read that in your latest book that I want to get to in a little bit. Conversion into this work you're doing now. You were convicted by that passage. And you used the word vulnerable. And this is, I think, focusing on the vulnerable in today's climate has led you to some positions that probably get you in trouble with some evangelicals. I'm thinking about your consistent life ethic when it comes to finding where you stand on abortion, or maybe how LGBTQ people should be welcomed in the church. Do you find yourself at odds with the larger evangelical world on positions like those two and other ethical?
Well, let's clarify what we mean by evangelicals.
Okay.
When the media says evangelical, they normally are referring to white evangelicals. Evangelicals of color in the black churches have a very different view of all these things. So I see black churches. I was kicked out of my little white church in Detroit as a young evangelical over issues of race and the Vietnam War. And I found my home in the black churches in Detroit who welcomed me and helped me to understand the wholeness of the gospel. This is to transform us, to save us and save the world. It's like how do we get changed, transformed, and then how do we change the world in the way Jesus taught us to. So the black churches, which are, I would say, more evangelical, if that means rooted in Jesus in the Bible, than a lot of white evangelicals are, taught me what, in fact, the meaning of this really was. So I want a consistent ethic of life, meaning I think both the left and the right have sometimes they have a selective notion of life, who's important, whose life and dignity is. So do we care about unborn life? Yes. Also about capital punishment, about nuclear weapons, about poverty, anything that denies the image of God, about voter suppression in North Carolina. To suppress a vote because of race is to suppress the image of God, Imago Dei. So let's take that theology and apply it to all of God's children and not a left or a right definition of that. Let's be consistent.
And I love the chapter in your new book on image of God, where you outline theology of Imago Dei, and where we are, I guess, Christianity demands that we view all of humanity in the image of God. And that changes everything, doesn't it?
It does. LGBTQ, very controversial. I want to start us in the church talking about, say, LGBTQ are all initials that are beloved of God. Let's start there. We have to agree on that.
Right.
And then how do we treat people? And so that'll be hopefully a civil discourse in our churches, but in our society, people shouldn't be treated differently or brutally because they're LGBTQ. So let's have that conversation. But remember, we're all beloved of God here. That's our starting point.
Right. And that transcends race, sexual orientation, gender, socioeconomics, all the things that divide us. The image of God breaks down those walls.
And in Galatians, it talks about in Christ there is no bond or free, male or female, Jew or Gentile. Those are race, class, and gender, always the divisive factors that divide human beings. And the early church said, we're breaking down those barriers. And that text, the Galatians text, was used at all the baptisms in the early church. They were kind of announcing, here's all these barriers and divisions that we all have. You should know we're breaking them down here. Baptism was a public event. So they were saying, we're breaking down all those barriers between, racial, class, gender barriers. And if you want to join us, Get ready for that, because that's what we do here. This isn't sort of a bubble. This isn't, Jesus said to love your neighbor, and he meant the ones who are different than you. And he meant love your enemies, even those that you're angry at all the time. What does that mean? So Jesus takes us to a whole different level here. So during 2020, I want to have conversations about Jesus. I say, don't go left, don't go right, go deeper. Go deeper. What did Jesus say? What did he mean? Did he mean it? And what does it mean for us in our polarized, divided environment where the vulnerable are the most in jeopardy?
Right. You've mentioned the polarized environment a couple of times, and you also mentioned that it's time for Christians to put faith over politics. Yeah. I believe we had National Day of Prayer last week, and you declined to attend, but you published your own prayer. And I believe that was one of the lines in your prayer, that it's time for Christians to put faith over politics.
The prayer breakfast, you mentioned that, was very interesting because Arthur Brooks was the speaker. I know Arthur, he's a friend, he's a conservative. And he said, we're full of contempt for each other in our politics. That's got to end. Then he read the words of Jesus about loving your enemies. He said, we have to learn. I'm a conservative. I have to learn to love liberals, even if I disagree. And he talked about Jesus' clear teaching. Then the president got up and said, Arthur, I disagree with you. Well, the president was disagreeing with this teaching of Jesus. That's what was just read. And that's a problem. And I want to say that happens on all sides of the political spectrum. Look at Twitter. Look at the way people talk about each other and their opponents and friends and neighbors. So Arthur was making a very important point. Even if you're angry, how do you not go into contempt and hatred? There's a whole lot of fear, hate, and violence. Those three move together. And now that's in our political discourse, shaping our public life. We have to go deeper here. And I think probably there won't be an agreement between MSNBC and Fox. But let's talk about Jesus, those of us who say we are his followers. Jesus says, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do the things that I say? That's a fair question from Jesus to us.
All right. You mentioned Arthur's comments, and I thought they were beautiful. How do we get beyond contempt? I do think that contempt is evident in much of our national discourse. Where do we go from here?
You know, I'm going around the country. I'm doing a week in a lot of states around the country, like here in North Carolina. And I'm really enjoying the conversation. It's really encouraging me because people want to get back to what did Jesus say? Love your neighbor. Who is my neighbor? We got to ask that question. What he says in the text, the Good Samaritan text, is the neighbor is the one who's not like you, who's different than you. What is truth? What is truth? Truth is so important. Jesus says, you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Meaning, if there's no truth, it's all falsehood, that leads to bondage. Who's important? Is leadership the servant or the dominant one? Jesus says, well, it's the one who serves. Fear. Politicians are running on fear. People are deeply afraid. Last night in the meeting we had in Western North Carolina, people said, I think it's fear. We're just all so afraid. Jesus said, be not afraid 8 times. Now, when politics is running on fear, what does it mean to say, be not afraid? There are things to be afraid of, hot stoves and fireplaces, but living in a spirit of fear is what's happening now. So I want to take the teachings of Jesus. This book is, every chapter is a question Jesus asked. The neighbor question, the fear question, what belongs to Caesar. All these questions are, in fact, Jesus questions. And I think they're for right now. And I want to, Ozzie, just ask very bluntly, is Jesus going to matter in this crisis we're in? Is he going to matter? And what does that mean? And could that at least calm our discourse? Not have us attack each other as persons, but look at what is the best way for us to go forward together.
Right. And you have a statement. You did a great job outlining your book, by the way. The 8 questions, the 8 chapters, maybe 10 chapters with the intro and conclusion. And I was particularly taken by three of the ones you just mentioned, the neighbor chapter, the fear chapter, I thought was quite powerful, and the Imago Dei chapter. In this book and elsewhere, you haven't been bashful about critiquing government when you feel that government needs to be critiqued. And that's sort of gotten you criticized for being too political from time to time. How do you bring together politics and religion when so many people are afraid to do that?
Well, I want to first say I believe in the separation of church and state. I really believe that. That's important. The state shouldn't impose, government shouldn't impose religion. It needs to protect all of our different faiths and people who have no faith at all. But that doesn't, separate church and state does not mean the segregation of moral values from public life. Dr. King knew he had to win a democratic debate to get a voting rights and civil rights law passed. Mm-hmm. But he invoked Amos and Isaiah and Jesus and the Constitution in doing so. We're in a pluralistic nation. So I want to always put my faith first and have that critique all the politics, left and right. I've had rigorous, ongoing conversations in the White House and elsewhere with political presidents and leaders on both sides. So how do we have a serious conversation? And right now, so much is at stake because democracy itself feels to me at stake now, and the integrity of our faith. And a whole generation is watching to see if white Christians especially have anything to say about, well, let me just say, the white nationalism we see growing and expanding and being more overt and arrogant. White nationalism isn't just racist, it's anti-Christ. It's against the teachings of Jesus. We can have different views of how to best reform the immigration system. That'll be some kind of compromise that's bipartisan. But when you dehumanize immigrants, when you strip migrant kids from their parents and put them in cages, that's anti-Christ. That's not following Jesus. That's not just lack of compassion. Or when you demean women, when you, assaulting and harassing and trafficking women, that's not just sexist. It's anti-Christ. So let's lift up Jesus here, and that I think will take us all deeper. I always say, don't go left, don't go right, go deeper here. Right now, if we just stay in our political anger and contempt, we're going to be in trouble for a long time. So how do we ask, what did Jesus say? What did he mean? Let's go through that. We're having book studies in churches to talk about Jesus and whether we want to pay attention to that. I hope Jesus does matter in this crisis, because I'm not sure where else to go in our politics.
And that's, of course, the title of your book, Christ in Crisis, Why We Need to Reclaim Jesus.
Reclaim Jesus means that he's worth reclaiming.
Right.
And he needs to be reclaimed.
And just to be clear, you're talking about Christians reclaiming Jesus. Is that correct?
Well, it's, yes,
or the
but
church reclaiming Jesus.
But what I'm finding to be, I'm delighted to see how after now 45 cities, Jesus has survived all of us Christians. And the interest in him is outside the church, not just inside. A whole lot of young people who have really rejected religion, or they check the box, none of the above, they affiliate with no religion. They're most believe in God. And they're hungry to talk about Jesus. So I've had great conversations with none of the aboves, young people who haven't gone to church for years, but are very interested in this brown Palestinian rabbi who wanted to turn the world upside down by changing our hearts and our minds and our societies.
And the young people, millennials in particular, they sometimes describe themselves as spiritual, but not particularly interested in institutional religion. In your book, you talk about political homelessness. Is there a sense of the church being spiritually homeless in today's society? It seems like Christianity is divided as well as divisions across political lines.
Or maybe if we're spiritually rooted and Jesus-centered, that can tend to make us politically homeless.
I see.
If that means that we don't come at things ideologically or politically, but from our faith and values. What is our faith? What are our values? In the chapter about Matthew 25, which you mentioned before, I call that the test of discipleship, where Jesus says in his last sermon before his crucifixion, he does this, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was naked. How you treat them is how you treat me. And that became a test of discipleship. He says, as you've done to the least of these, you have done to me. I want to say the least of these are the least important in Washington, D.C. Least important in our politics. So how do we look at how the least of these are faring in these times? And that should be what shapes our politics. Jesus says the least of these. That's who I want you to pay most attention to.
And that's been your consistent message for nearly half a century.
Well, I've learned that from a lot of elders. There was an old black woman in my neighborhood, Mary Glover, old Pentecostal lady, and she prayed before every time we put out a bag of groceries every Saturday morning for people who needed them. 20 blocks in the White House, they needed groceries. And she'd say, I'd come home just to hear her prayer. She'd say, Lord, thank you for waking me up today. Thank you, my room was not my grave, and my bed was not my cooling board. Then she'd say, Lord, we know you'll be coming through this line today. So Lord, help us to treat you well.
That's a wonderful story. I love that story. Well, I'm going to ask you a question that might be akin to asking you to name your favorite child, but I'm just wondering, over the years, over the decades, what are you most proud of?
I think I've said this to our staff at Sojourners. We've been blessed to do some really important work, some great work, and we see that. But I think our legacy is in the lives of people who've been inspired by what we've said and done. It's what they do, which I see all over the country, amazing things, that they just decide to follow Jesus, to help those migrants in the desert, to have that church under the bridge with the homeless, to spend time with the people who nobody wants to spend time with. So I think the community, the extended Sojourners community, is what I'm most proud of. And people always say, how do I join that? How do I be a part of that? Our website is sojo.net, and that's a place where you can find each other. You know, people feel alone. And last night after the session, they said, I don't feel alone anymore. Look at all the people who came. Huh. You feel alone, but sometimes you need each other. Sometimes you got to preach the choir, but also mobilize the choir. Right. So right now, I want to see people really acting on their faith in this 2020 season.
So all the books, all the decades of Sojourners Magazine, and the thing you're most proud of are these interconnections between human beings.
What I see people doing in going back to relationship with each other. Right. When moms talk about the future hopes and dreams for their kids, it's bonding. It's not happening across racial lines in this country. That has to change. My two boys are baseball players. They're teammates. For serious athletes, your teammates are your best friends. Those are multiracial. Churches where we're finally listening to each other's stories, how black parents and white parents have different life experiences every day in America. Where do we talk about that? How do we understand each other? How do we identify with each other's suffering as well as honoring each other? So to me, this nation will no longer be a white majority nation by 2040. That's the elephant in the room in all the politics in Washington, D.C. Who's going to guide us to a different place where there's a we and not just an us versus them? That, to me, is the vocation of those who call themselves the followers of Jesus.
And the who is, as you said, reclaiming Jesus. It would be Christ in crisis. And this book is a great place to start. And I want to thank you. I know you're very busy, but you took time out of your schedule to join us here on Religion and Life. So thank you so much.
My blessing.
Yes.
Thanks, Ozzie.
And that's it for Religion and Life for this week. I hope you'll join us next week as well. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwald.